Nice, sexy voice there, Mrs. Bo Fung. The question is, if I push to talk, can they hear my transmission? And I knew that after my last video discussing secure and mostly legal communications, that I was going to get some outstanding comments that were going to come in, and they were. Some of them were fabulistic. And so a lot of folks, were arguing that you cannot have secure radio communications, especially on something like the Baofeng, right? Because it is free and open and in the clear. It's not encrypted. So we're going to break this down Barney style and see what we can't get into. Make sure you leave some comments down to this one so we can continue to keep this conversation rolling as we all seek to master our craft and develop our tactical virtue. So if I pick up a radio and I hit that push to talk, can they hear, before we even address who the they is that you need to be most concerned about, because it's probably not who you think that it is, the answer to the question is technically yes, but also no. And so we'll dive into this one and then discuss who that they is that you need to be most concerned about. When you push to talk on a radio, I don't care if it's UHF, VHF, or HF, in any band, if somebody is out there and they are on the same frequency, within range, they can hear what you're putting down, right? However, pause for dramatic effect. It is highly unlikely that anybody's listening to your transmissions. Now, let me back up what I'm saying, that ultimately, while it is not secure, I would offer this challenge out to anybody who thinks that they are the ham schmam of the internet. If you think you can determine my transmissions, and even better, my location, to drop a comment and we'll have a challenge. And I can almost guarantee you that you will not be able to do so. Even as I operate on the free and clear, you're not going to be able to discover my transmissions or determine my location. Boom. Challenge issued. Let's get to it. Who wants some of that? Come on. So first thing we need to know and understand is that on a typical Baofeng radio on VHF, and that's the smaller of the two bands that they have these enabled to transmit on. On VHF, the frequency range is 136 to 174, right? And that's megahertz. And so you have frequency steps of 2.5 kilohertz to 50 kilohertz in between each frequency that you're operating on. So if we do the math between 136 and 174, I'm going to dumb it down and say that you have 40 megahertz that you're operating in. So that's 40,000 kilohertz if I'm doing my math right. How many frequencies can you operate on VHF? So could you, if you had let's say you have something fancy schmancy like SDR, which is not all that fancy. It's pretty cheap to get into. Or you have some really good spec annies. You're still not going to be able to listen in on every single conversation because the traffic, especially in an urban environment, is flooded. It's flooded on both UHF and VHF. Man, you have people talking on these things all day long. And so for anybody to say that if you push to talk, they're listening to you, they can hear you, well, they can hear you, but do they even know to listen to you? And do they know what you're talking about? If I only make a transmission, let's just say at 06, if you're not scanning and listening at 06 and happen to see this channel pop on for 15, 20 seconds, and that's to and from, right? Transmit and receive, you're never going to hear it because it was hidden in the open, right in plain sight, right underneath your nose. And if my next planned transmission is at 1900, 7 o'clock p.m., same thing is going to apply. So unless you are going through this stuff with a fine-tooth comb, you literally have to get lucky to find the right people that you're trying to listen in on. Because you have to know that it's happening. You have to know when. You have to be within range. And you have to be able to identify that this piece of information is actually intelligence that needs to be discerned, deciphered, and actioned on. Now, what's the range on these things? Never gone past 2 miles. And I've only gotten just over 2 miles in a wooded environment on flat terrain. In an urban environment, man, in my own testing, I really wouldn't trust these things out beyond a mile. Because even out there, although it's broken and a little readable, it's sketchy. It's hit and miss. And so although there are folks out there who would argue that, on only 5 watts, I can talk, thousands of miles away. That can be possible if you have the right antenna on the right band at the right time of day with the right weather variables. When all of these things align, you can do some pretty outstanding things. That is not an untrue statement. But who is this they? Right? Is the FCC out there listening to you? Is the NSA? Is it the CIA, FBI? Are they looking to crack down on everybody who's operating the Baofeng radios? Do they have listening stations? Yes. But they're not listening for you. They don't care what it is that you're doing until the they that you need to be most concerned about inform the FCC that you are operating on these radios. Now, who's this they? Ham operators. It's ham operators. These are the guys that you need to be concerned about, especially if you start fudging on the edges or if you start using frequencies that you shouldn't be using, right? If you're not licensed and you're operating and these people discover you, they're going to file a complaint. If you're on frequencies that are allocated for specific entities or organizations and you interfere with that or you bleed over into it, then you're going to cause a problem for yourself. And these are the folks that are going to raise the red flag. And the FCC, if you're doing it long enough, you can find, because the FCC has to, by law, publish all the times that they call the red flag on somebody. And when you read through the historical documents on these things, you're never going to find somebody who was fined, who's just out using a radio, a little handheld radio. No, what you're going to find at the most, you'll find folks that were either threatened with a fine or were potentially fined or were fined. But these were the guys that were operating like pirate radio stations, right? They're not just using it to communicate with friends or family or local community groups. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that or should not do that. Like, if you want to use these radios on these bands, then you need to get your license so that you know that you're G to G, so that when the ham guy complains about you because you didn't call in with your call sign every 10 minutes and he files and lodges a complaint because you're operating off of your base station at your house and he did his own radio direction finding and he discovered where you're at, that you're going to be good to go, right? So do the right thing. I mean, accept the risk that you want to accept. These folks are not looking for some guy who's out taking a hike and doing some overlanding, keeping in touch with some folks. And so that's where I would submit to you that you are able to hide in the open using GMRS, using UHF, and using VHF. You don't have to get into HF. You can hide in the open. You could transmit all kinds of stuff all day long. And if you know how to communicate well, even if somebody happened to scan and they saw your frequency hitting and they stayed on it for a little bit and they heard what you were saying, you don't have any concerns. You got to be smart about what you're doing. So, team, looking forward to your thoughts and your comments down below as we continue to keep this conversation rolling. As always, until then, you stay out there, you keep grinding, and you stay stoked.